Day's LGBT network, I warmly welcome you to the Barbican. My name is Adam Lamb, my pronouns are he, him, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussions on LGBT identities and faith. I'm a solicitor in Leigh Day's Clinical Negligence Department, and I'm also a founding member of the LGBT network at Leigh Day. As many of you are aware, February is LGBT History Month, which is why we have chosen to hold tonight's event. LGBT History Month offers us a time to reflect on the events that have shaped our community and identify areas that are yet to be improved. We at Leigh Day are also excited that tonight is being supported by the Law Society of England and Wales. To formally introduce tonight, the discussion and the panel, where I'd like to welcome Netanya Clixby, who is from the Law Society's Division and Inclusion LGBT Lawyers Division, and she will kick off the proceedings for us.
Thanks very much, Adam, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for Leigh Day for putting on this event this evening. So as Adam mentioned, I'm Netanya Clixby. I'm a finance lawyer, and I'm also the bisexual representative on the Law Society's LGBT plus Lawyers Division Committee, which is a mouthful, I appreciate. The Law Society is very committed to promoting diversity in the profession, and the Law Society's LGBT plus Lawyers Division is the voice for LGBT lawyers in the profession, and we aim to raise visibility of issues affecting LGBT plus lawyers. We're here tonight to mark the start of LGBT History Month, and we're here for a lovely panel discussion to discuss how different faiths see LGBT plus identities and to hear a bit about the intersectionality between being of faith and LGBT. And so you probably all know this idiom of bringing your whole selves to work. This is used to refer to feeling totally comfortable about who you are in the workplace. And it also is related to sexual orientation, but not exclusively so. And one of the things that we find that LGBT plus lawyers struggle with is being able to bring your whole selves to work. And this can be because of their LGBT identity, but it's an additional issue for people who have an intersecting identity, such as being LGBT plus and of faith. For example, if an LGBT plus of faith lawyer is in a firm, they may feel that they can't become a member of the firm's faith network because they may feel like they will be rejected on the grounds of their LGBT plus identity. And then on the flip side, they might not want to join the LGBT plus network because they might think that that network will think that they're self-hating or disingenuous. So instead of having two groups where they can feel connected, they actually become very isolated in the workplace. And as personally, from my own experience, I am a BAME bisexual Jew. And so when I started my training contract, I very much felt that feeling of isolation, that I didn't really feel I could bring my whole self to work. I didn't feel comfortable in the organisation. But I was lucky enough to work for two firms that were very focused on embracing intersectionality. And they encouraged me to join the Law Society's LGBT plus Lawyers Division Committee and to also co-found the London Bisexual Network, which is a network for professionals working in the city who are bi or allies. Events like this one tonight are, that promote discussions around diversity and inclusion in a public setting are so important for people like me because it creates a platform to discuss issues that can be very uncomfortable otherwise, and it really makes a difference. So thanks again to Leigh Day for hosting the event. Now we have an excellent panel of speakers. I will introduce them. We're going to be hearing from Reverend Rachel Mann, who is from the Church of England. We have Miss Hafsa Qureshi from Stonewall UK. We have Miss Dalia Fleming, who is Executive Director of Keshet UK, which is a Jewish LGBT plus organisation. And we have Mr. Dharam Singh from Sarbat LGBT Sikhs. Can we please give them all a very warm welcome?
Thank you very much, Netanya. The relationship between religion and the LGBT community is a complicated one, and some people are of the opinion that there is a conflict between the two. Within the last 12 months, we've had the parents of pupils at Parkfield Community School in Birmingham protest over relationship lessons, which they claimed promote gay and transgendered lifestyles. Then only last month, The Church of England issued pastoral guidance stating that sex belongs only within heterosexual marriage and that sex outside of this falls short of the God's purpose of human beings. I should add that some people within the Church of England. I'm sure Reverend Rachel will correct me. Tonight, our superb panel will discuss these, amongst other topical issues, from their own personal perspectives of being a person of faith and in the LGBT community. I now turn to each member of the panel and ask them to introduce A, their faith and position in the community, and their LGBT identity, and why LGBT inclusion is important to them. Can I please start with Rachel?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Rachel Mann, and I am an Anglican Church of England parish priest based in South Manchester. I'm also an honorary canon of Manchester Cathedral, member of the Church of England's governing body, the General Synod, a member of their theological advisory panel as well, and I'm a writer, a poet, a broadcaster on Radio 4 and Radio 2. I don't get much sleep, but actually one of the threads that runs through that signal in all that I've just said of privilege. You might be thinking, well, what's someone who's that privileged doing here? Is that I'm a trans woman, and I transitioned in the early 90s, so nearly 30 years ago. I transitioned before I came to faith, and in the mid-90s, that's when I found I came to a living faith in Jesus Christ, and somehow or other, absurdly, ridiculously, but dare I say it, gloriously, I've ended up wearing a dog collar.
That introduction, yes.
Just hold the microphone a little bit.
I have a lot to live up to, but I'll try. My name is Dharam Singh. I help run Sarbat, the Sikh LGBT group. I'm not a member of that many entities, but I'm a civil servant, but I help run Sarbat in my spare time. I remember getting involved in Sarbat around 10 years ago when I just visited a networking event for Sikhs to meet others, LGBT Sikhs, and I never came across, I had never come across other Sikhs who were LGBT, so it was quite refreshing. It was also quite interesting because I never thought there was a conflict in being Sikh and LGBT. It was probably other Sikhs who thought that there's a conflict, but based on my understanding, I never felt a conflict. So not only I was convinced, but I found the struggle trying to convince others because they wanted to use personal homophobia with no scriptural justification in the Sikh faith. And that's what I wanted to tell them, that there is no homophobia in the Sikh faith. Everything about Sikhism is equality. I don't see any conflict in it. And whether you accept me or not, here I am, and I help support other Sikh people in a similar situation. So, yeah, that's pretty much me. Thank you.
This works. Hi, I'm Dalia Fleming. I'm the Executive Director of Keshet UK. Keshet UK works to create a world where no one is forced to choose between their Jewish and LGBT plus identity. If you're ever in a position in which society, your community, your family are forcing you to choose between those intrinsic identities, whether that be Torah or food or family, whatever your Judaism means to you, and other intrinsic identities, you walk through the world in a broken way. We work with Jewish schools, youth and young adult organizations, synagogues, and wider Jewish communal organizations like the Jewish care homes, leadership bodies, security organizations, really any Jewish organization that an LGBT plus person and their family might engage with, we would like to work with in order for those people to have the experience that they expect to have. I come to this work having been brought up in technically an Orthodox Jewish household. The anecdote that I give is that my mum was brought up in the kind of council estates of the East End of London, brought up quite Orthodox. My dad's a Holocaust survivor. And so my mum had quite a religious identity and would try to keep a kosher household. So, don't eat milk and meat together, don't have pork or shellfish, that kind of household. My dad's identity was much more cultural. He'd survived the Holocaust. He was quite Jewish in his eyes. And, he'd bring in the pig's feet. So that's the kind of household that I grew up in. And then I went to an Orthodox Jewish secondary school. And at school, I was never really bullied for being LGBT+. I've been out since kind of my mid-teens. I was predominantly bullied for being a boff, for being too enthusiastic. But actually, when I was 16, I was in a lesson, and that lesson was on homosexuality. And in it, I was told by teachers that being LGBT+ was an abomination, that I should marry a man. And I think what's interesting about that lesson is two things. Number one, I think very rarely do young people agree with everything their teachers say, but also, hopefully even rarer than that, do teachers tell you that who you intrinsically are is wrong. So that was a kind of a turning point in my life for that. But also, secondly, that I remember that class vividly. I remember where I was sitting, I remember who else was in that class, I remember when it was said. I remember the people who agreed, disagreed with that teacher, and for other people in that class, whether they are now actually out as LGBT+, or whether they were allies or people who agreed with the teacher, for a lot of them, they have no recollection of it. It's either been something that's been scarred out their memory or it just wasn't about them. What's really cool in this kind of circle of life moment that I'm now having as a queer Jewish professional is we go into that school. And we work with the year 7s to year 13s. We've done teacher training for their Jewish studies teachers, for their pastoral teachers. And they still believe, and we'll probably talk about this later, that Jewish law, halakha, is halakha. But there are different ways you can talk about it, different ways you can teach about it, and different ways you can ensure the well-being and safety of the young people. So I guess I come to this work because that and the rest of kind of my life has not only impacted myself, but my community and my family, and ensuring that the community understands the harm that has been caused and the spaces that should be doing more or are already doing awesome and can do better is really important work.
Okay, I gotta follow that. So my name is Hafsa, my pronouns are she, her. I work at Stonewall, but I'm just sort of representing myself, I guess. I do a lot of work and activism around queer Muslims and queer Jarbis, as I like to call us. I find it very important to me as a Muslim to service my community, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around Islam, around sexuality, around who we can be in society, and a lot of pressures, especially on Muslim women, on individuals who kind of work outside that scope of what is considered normal for our communities. So I find it quite vital to be some form of visibility. Of course, there are lots of queer Muslims and a lot of queer Jarbis out there, but I am incredibly privileged in that it's not harmed my life when I came out as bi, and I was incredibly privileged that I was very accepted in talking about these things and having that discussion. So I wanted to use that privilege to raise visibility and raise awareness for all my other sort of queer siblings who are also Muslim, who can't be as visible as I am, because unfortunately in the communities I'm in, that can be dangerous. It can lead to violence. It can lead to violence, isolation, being kicked out of your home, all kinds of situations. And I am sort of incredibly privileged in that I've not experienced those things, and I'm very lucky. But that is a reality that people in my community have to face. And that's not something I want to sit down and accept, because it shouldn't be acceptable to be treated in such a way just for coming out as who you are. So that's what my work is centered around, is just allowing people to thrive as they are, allowing especially queer Muslims, young queer Muslims, who message me all the time saying, like, this is the first time I've seen a queer Muslim. And they've probably met a queer Muslim before, but it's the first time they've heard that it's okay to be queer and Muslim. And I definitely think that's something that I'm sure many of us want to have, that conversation of you can be a person of faith and a queer person as well. it doesn't need to be a decision between the two of should I wear a rainbow flag or should I wear my hijab today, you know. So that's where I'm coming from. But yeah.
Thank you. What's the biggest misconception about your religion's position on LGBT issues? Perhaps, Dharam, you could kick us off.
So there is quite a lot of stress in the Sikh faith about living a family life. And that has kind of ended up meaning that it's some sort of a conventional heterosexual household living. But you don't have to be in a conventional relationship to have a family life. So I think that's one of the kind of stereotypes about, within the Sikh community itself, that when people talk about family life and the way people translate scripture, that comes across. But Sikhism is also about dealing with everyday problems and living in the current world, not becoming an ascetic and living in the Himalayas or whatever. And it comes from dealing with everyday problems today. So that's one of the big things I'd like to address.
Just for the sake of the audience, could you just sort of give an overview of what your faith's position is on LGBT issues?
So the Sikh faith, at least in my reading and reading of lots of other people, is about equality, that being the cornerstone to who we are, around gender, faith, race, sexuality. And this equality is all-encompassing, and there are lots of conflicts, and there are lots of misunderstanding about what this equality means. But at the end of the day, the term equality is taken to be quite serious, and that overrides the need for people to segregate or differentiate between themselves. So I can give you an example. I grew up in India, and my first memory of being a Sikh when I was a child is going to a Sikh temple, which some of you may already be aware of, and something quite radical when the Sikh faith was being formed is the communal kitchen, where everyone, regardless of their caste or the social status, will sit next to each other and have a vegetarian meal prepared by the Sikh temple. That in its way might not mean a lot, but it's incredibly radical for the time when it was conceived in India at that time, where people didn't actually talk to each other or didn't even communicate. But sitting next to each other, whoever you are, those are one of my first memories of being a Sikh. Although I don't come from a religious household, I come from an incredibly liberal Sikh household. But those are one of my first memories of the Sikh faith, and it speaks of equality.
Thank you. Rachel?
Oh my goodness, what's really tricky here is finding the appropriate place to start, because wherever I start from will lead into confusion and bewilderment, because I actually think, and I just flag up here, I do not speak on behalf of the Church of England, only me. But the Church of England has a mastery of doublethink. And therefore, depending on where you start, you will get bewildered very quickly. Are you all aware of the general catastrophe that was the so-called Pastoral Statement that happened? It blew up about 10 days ago. In one sense, that is a very precise statement of what the Church of England believes about matters of sex, sexuality, and relationship. In one sense, it basically, there is a tiny group of people who have contracted a sacramental marriage, and then there's the rest of us, and we're all falling short. But I think, actually, that it is a profound misunderstanding to imagine that and what it gestures towards, which is a kind of centralized, monolithic Church of England, akin to a kind of, second-rate Catholic church with all the curia and the Pope and all the rest of it. That ain't the Church of England. Or at least it's not the Church of England I know. It's one version of it. It's a version which is moderated through the current position of the House of Bishops, and one which has been affirmed 30-odd years ago by the General Synod. And then there's the actual Church of England, which is as messy and bewildering and glorious and wonderful and mean as we all are, actually. By which I mean the kind of place where I'm a parish priest, we get it wrong quite a lot because we're flawed human beings, but we are working constantly, energetically, to model God's divine and inclusive love. So that those people who come to St. Nick's on a Sunday or midweek know that if they're non-binary, they're not just welcome and tolerated, they're the beloved of God. They're part of the image of God and the likeness of Christ. Similarly, our clergy team is about as queer as it gets. There's a trans rector, and our two curates are both gay men, one of whom's in a civil partnership. We, at the local level, are at our best. But I still want to say sorry, and I know I represent the church here a bit, so I'm really sorry that we did that with that pastoral statement, and it should have been withdrawn in my view, and it wasn't, and the apology feels rather mealy-mouthed. But I actually say to each and every one of you, should you wish to engage with your local parish church, yes, you will find some who are very conditional in their love and welcome, but most people and most churches now, in my experience, are travelling in the right direction because, coming back finally to the pastoral statement, as I discovered on Sunday, when I stood up to apologise to our congregation, very diverse congregation, for the first time ever, there was a whole bunch of people in that congregation who would identify as straight, have been in long-term faithful relationships, some of whom, maybe divorced, remarried, who thought, oh my God, my own bishops currently seem to think that I'm falling short. And that felt like a watershed moment. And I think things are going to change quite quickly now. So we're not monolithic. We're idiotic. And we're beautiful too.
Here. Dalia.
In terms of misconceptions, I think for people who know the Jewish community, this won't be a misconception, but we're not a very homogenous group. I think is one thing about us. There's the joke of, you ask 5 rabbis for their opinion, you get 12 answers, and it's very true. But actually, I think in terms of the Jewish community around LGBT plus people and our lives, it's really, really diverse. You've got members of our community in parts of kind of the liberal and reform movements who've been at the forefront of LGBT plus progress in the UK for generations. And then you've also got elements that struggle to talk about it, and some who say some pretty explicit homophobic, biphobic, transphobic stuff. And I think understanding that actually there are lots of different voices and lots of different homes that one can have. It sometimes means that some LGBT plus Jewish people have to be in homes or communities that aren't safe for them, but that there are voices even within those spaces who are beginning to talk more and to think about what it means to be kind, because actually I'm not an expert on halakha, on Jewish law. In fact, one of our kind of ground rules for Keshet UK sessions is that is not what we talk about. We talk about how you can actively do things, and we work with the community. So if I'm working with a synagogue or a school or a community organization, like they will have people who understand the kind of the Jewish law. And in fact, last year, September 2018, which feels like last year, but I'm not sure it was, we launched a guide with Chief Rabbi Mervis, who's kind of the Orthodox Chief Rabbi in the UK, around the well-being of LGBT plus pupils, a guide for Orthodox Jewish schools, which was one of the first kind of guides of its kind. And in it, he talks about halakha, he talks about Jewish law. And in fact, it's very easy to find online different perspectives, some of which can be more hurtful and some of which can be more settling for kind of LGBT plus Jewish people and our families.
Thank you very much. Hafsa.
So I always preface this by saying that I am not an Islamic scholar. Don't quote me on things. I just go by how I was raised and what I personally believe. So like I was raised religious and I still consider myself to be religious. And basically there's a lot of different views on where queer people sit when it comes to Islam. Some people think that queer people shouldn't exist. None of it's okay. It's all prohibited. And they'll reference this story or that story from the Quran and then sort of justify their means that way. Other people will treat it as, well, it's the act that's prohibited, the physical act between two people who are not married versus the actual thought of the action. The way I look at it and the way I personally view being queer and being Muslim and being a person of faith, following Islam, is that when we talk about ourselves as Muslims, we talk about being an ummah. We talk about ourselves being wahid, which means one. We talk about ourselves being together. When I think of a community, I don't think of half a group thinking the other shouldn't exist. I think of a group that is completely united. So when I think of Islam, I think about the community and how we service that and how we grow that community. And when I think about what I'm doing as a Muslim, we see ourselves as servants of God. We see ourselves in service to our community and the people around us. I think, well, from my extremely privileged position, I have the ability to help other people choose to live as themselves in a small way, in a very, very small way, but I have the ability to help them in a small way. And I'd feel that that's my service to my community, and that's something I should be doing, not just as a queer person, but as a Muslim. And that's how I view it. But again, it can differ completely. But that's the way I view it, because if I want to be a good Muslim, to me, that is in service. It's to be kind to one another. As we've mentioned before, it's being good to each other. I think regardless of faith or denomination, that's something we can all agree on, is be kind to one another. So I think that's something that we should focus on, and that's something I think a lot of queer Muslims struggle with when it comes to people quoting scripture at them angrily. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the Parkfield School and the situation with relationships and sex education. These angry parents protesting the No Outsiders program, telling their students or assuming there were rumors going around, they're showing, adult material to our kids and all sorts of things, which wasn't true, of course. But unfortunately, a lot of what we believe in our community can get conflated very, very quickly, to the point where Muslims are striven towards gaining education and learning and educating others. And then we have this situation with the schools where it's like we're taking our children out of school, which was deeply shocking to me. But also, as a Muslim, I have to recognize that people will do as they please, and people will follow a way of life that has always made sense to them. And they may turn to me and think that I'm crazy or that I'm deviating from Islam completely, but our choices in this life are our choices. So I think we need to be able to have an open-ended environment where someone can look at me and say, that's not for me, that's not how I follow Islam, that's not how I choose to live, but that's your way of living. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Hafsa, you kind of touched on this in your answer, but are there any LGBT-related issues that divide people within Islam? You've just touched on the school example. Are there any other issues that you believe are quite divisive?
It's kind of similar to what you said earlier regarding Sarbat and how you view, like, the community views family. This is more of a cultural conflation, but there's very much an opinion that if you're a woman or you're a man, and you can only be a woman or a man, of course, in this scenario, of course, that you must get married, you must have kids, you must sort of propagate, and that's the way it's always been, that's how things should be. But that's not reflected in our society. That's not reflected in us as people. We know that gender is not binary. We know that sexuality is fluid and that we can be who we want to be. And so it's kind of going out of those rigid confines to say that, actually a family does not look like a man and a woman. and not everyone wants to have children, and all these little individual choices. Every single individual thing that you do outside of those choices placed upon you is almost like defying those things. Like me being bi, identifying as queer is defying that stereotype of I must get married, I must have kids, I must do this, I must do that. And it's difficult to even say as a woman, I want to keep doing this, I don't want to get married, I don't want to. So it's breaking down those barriers of what is actually our religion and what is actually the cultural expectation. Like just as a simple example is if a couple gets married, for example, and they want to move out of their family home, that's considered quite shocking. Or if someone wants to get divorced, something that has been permissible in Islam for a really, really long time, it's considered shocking and unacceptable. And then those same people will turn around and say, actually, you shouldn't be allowed to do this. You shouldn't be allowed to be queer, and your existence is confusing to me. I do enjoy talking to those religious police and saying to them, well, did you know that the women we hold beloved, that we consider really important figures in Islam, were divorced? I mean, is that something you just neglected in your mission to educate other people? So that's my view. I'm not sure if I answered the question in a very roundabout way, but I hope that answered it.
Now, and Dalia, from your point of view, are there any issues that you think divide people within Judaism?
I mean, in a very stereotypical way, but also genuine. I mean, whether we exist. In some parts of the community, there is still a question whether Jewish LGBT plus people are there. And often we have conversations with people and they might say very kind of good-heartedly, you know, we don't have any Jewish LGBT plus people, so we don't have any homophobia or biphobia or transphobia or any issues. And for us, our response is always, well, there's one of two things. One is they're hiding, and that silence can be deadly. And actually the silence from a community can be more afraid. I'm more afraid when people say there is no one than, well, there's a lesbian. They come to pray every week. And I'm like, great. How do people know that you're so inclusive? How did the lesbian know to come to this synagogue? And then the other option is that they have actively left. Why is that? What are you doing about that? And then even more concerningly is the young people who very regularly have no agency about where they are, what community they're in. And so I think in parts of the community, it's whether we exist, it's how the interpretation of Jewish law, which really varies. And then actually we have the same cultural issues that I think wider society has around trans inclusion, around lots of other things that I think are completely tearing apart our society in general. And that seeps into all communities. And so no matter how progressive a community may seem or has been, I think there are elements that are really dividing communities. And then when you add in a religious element that then brings in conversations that you wouldn't have on a day-to-day. Earlier today, I was talking to someone and we were talking about what happens if you convert to Judaism at the same time as transitioning and what happens around circumcision. So that conversation brings in lots of different elements when you think about what it means to have surgery. Then they started talking about children. I was like, that's not the topic we're talking about right now, but good point. And so you end up talking about things that, you don't usually talk about, but you have to think about, because actually circumcision is a rite of passage for a lot of people in Judaism. And what do you do if someone is converting and transitioning? And so, and that conversation is complicated, not always dividing, but complicated right now.
Dharam.
So I'm kind of reminded of double standards in society, at least in the West. The Sikh faith, the Sikh community doesn't receive as much scrutiny as some other faith groups do. The media seems to be obsessed with a particular religion, whereas there are lots of issues in the Sikh faith that don't get covered, which leads me on to discussions that I had in Sikh dining tables. It's about, there's been a lurch that's been noticed, by quite a lot of people, quite a lot of my peers, towards, can't think of a better word, towards being more extreme in your religion. And that stems out from insecurities. So there's lots of dinner-side conversations about the Sikhs are actually dwindling in numbers, and allegedly we're not having enough babies, or we're marrying too much outside the Sikh faith, which leads to controversies in the West where mixed marriages between Sikhs and non-Sikhs are not as welcomed as they used to be at one point, and the sense that get pushed our way towards the LGBT community is that you're not helping this anyway, and there are lots of divisions being caused by these insecurities that never get talked about, but they're kind of brewing. So this is one of the kind of quite a big contention that lots of Sikhs talk about or don't talk about, at least not in public, but this is the reality, unfortunately.
And Rachel?
I think the first thing that I want to say is in danger of sounding facetious, but there is a truth to this around the C of E, and in my perception, it is comedically, absurdly, and distressingly white and middle class, and that means that working with certain stereotypes around that, it can be very difficult to discern what people are disagreeing about because they don't want to talk about things. There's a sort of sense of, oh, just get on with it. Can you just get on with it? But please do not mention anything. And what people fall out about are the flower rotors, or who's making the tea, because these are proxy wars for other things to do with, hatred for, Anyway, somewhat less facetiously, I think that I want to echo some of the things that other people on the panel have said, because I think that there is so much of the division points are located around identity and what we might call theologized or theological understandings of identity. In other words, what does it actually mean to be a human being? And I think that those people who belong to what I guess I would call myself a progressive Catholic, we are seeking always to try and integrate not only scripture and tradition, but actually the best that our cultural productions can offer. The kind of things which we discover in history about what it is to be a human being. And I think that there are some people within the C of E who really freak out, to be blunt, about that willingness to discern grace in what's happening in culture. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but I know that certainly when it comes to questions about trans identity, and oh my goodness, there's been quite a lot of pushback in certain quarters within the C of E in the last 18 months about the status of trans people. Generally, the conservative evangelical perspective draws on a conception of revealed law that says, well, the Bible says this, male and female, he made them. And so much rests on that conjunction. What does and mean here? Is it or is it and as both? Generally, evangelicals will say it's either or. And then traditional Catholics will draw on kind of Aristotelian philosophy refracted through Thomas Aquinas that says natural law. So in nature, what we discover is this binary. And that binary is found in the sexes, and sexes have defined roles to do with reproduction. Now, I think any of us who, I mean, forgive me, maybe you will disagree when it comes to questions, but I think any of us who've given some attention to the history of ideas and also the history of science and how that operates, and also about culture, will want to offer something a bit more nuanced than that. But these non-negotiables for some people, it's scripture or tradition, or a kind of combination of both.
Thank you. Dalia, I'm going to move on to you, the next question. During your lifetime, have you seen a shift, either good or bad, in your faith's position on LGBT issues?
Yes. Yes. No, definitely. I think when you look at all the different parts of the community, like speaking UK specifically, the community's moved on massively. I mean, some things weren't legal, and parts of our community, the liberal communities, were kind of supporting kind of same-sex marriage before it was even legal. And for other parts of the communities, they've had intense discussions and conversations around what they will do. And once again, kind of even on the Orthodox perspective, I wouldn't say there has been a change, but actually I was meeting with a rabbi when I first started in this job, and we have a lot of confidential conversations. A lot of the time, the reason we're quite quiet, a lot of the time, a lot of people outside of the Jewish community have never heard of us is because we aren't very big on social media, and that's quite intentional because we like to call people in and not call people out. We're not loud because we want people to feel confident they can build trust with us. So I was having a conversation with a rabbi, and at the end I said, do you want this conversation to be confidential? And he said, an Orthodox rabbi, I should premise, he said, well, if we can't even say that we're talking, the problem is greater than I think. And I think the problem is sometimes greater than he thinks. However, there is a lot more conversation happening. And actually, when there is backlash, because there still is backlash when some Orthodox community members speak about it, others are more confident now to speak up and say, well, actually, if we can't have this conversation, if we can't think about what do we do in our schools and to protect young people, where are we as a community? And that kind of change in terms of people being able to talk about it may not seem big. But when you're dealing with parts of a community that deal with hundreds and thousands of years as their metric, not days and weeks like many of us would want change to occur in, to me that's substantial.
Dharam, what about from a Sikh perspective? Have you seen a shift either for the good or for the bad in your faith position on LGBT issues?
I'd say contention and discussion has been fantastic in the last few years about issues faced not only by LGBT people, but also other disadvantaged groups who happen to share the Sikh identity. So, at least in my experience, there's been a lot of talk about the Sikh wedding ceremony, which is a union, as it's written, of two genderless souls with God. And so there is no mention of gender in the Sikh Anand Karj, it's called. It's a marriage ceremony that's prescribed. The only condition being the two people have to be Sikhs. And that's had quite a lot of discussion taking place. So whether that excludes or whether that includes a whole set of people, for the future. So those kind of discussions are quite encouraging. The charity I help run, Sarbat, we share a lot of resources and, for example, posters, imagery, and that pops up in Pride marches everywhere, in Kenya, Singapore, India. It's fascinating to see that. And I'd say most of the Sikh organizations have been quite supportive of our cause. They want to hear our side of the story, which has, been brushed under the carpet for most of history. But I usually tell people that there is no explicit mention of homosexuality in any way in the Sikh faith, despite when the religion was being formed, there were lots of homosexual kind of peers or wise men, in that part of Punjab, in India. So, you have to ask yourself, why wasn't that included? So asking these questions has kind of made quite a lot of huge dent in the way people respond.
Thank you. Rachel, during your lifetime, have you seen a shift?
Absolutely, in terms, leaving aside the mess created in the wake of the Pastoral Statement, yes, there's been a shift in the mood music. I think there has been a shift in the rhetoric for the most part. So, for example, as a result of the General Synod of the Church of England refusing to take note of a House of Bishops report on sexuality in July 2017, the Archbishop started talking about a new radical Christian inclusion. The truth of the matter is I think we're still waiting. There is a project underway called Living in Love and Faith, which it may bear fruit. It may bear fruit. This is an attempt to bring new theological and sociological and scientific approaches to our discourse on sexuality and gender identity. The mood music has changed, but one little story. There is something, and I do say this with affection. I have a kind of professional stake in the game here. There is something almost touchingly Orwellian about the Church of England, by which I mean, do you remember in 1984, there are the various sort of super states. They're at war with each other, but then they change the narrative. So they say, Eurasia is at war with East Asia, and then it changes, and then they say, Eurasia has never been at war with East Asia, and it kind of changes the narrative. And there is something of the C of E about that, because 2005, civil partnerships came in. At the time, the House of Bishops was saying, oh no, we don't like those. We really don't, we do not commend those for our LGBT people, especially not the clergy. And then, of course, the law changes, 2013 was it, with the Equal Marriages Act? At which point, the House of Bishops said, we really, really commend civil partnerships for LGBT people in the Church of England, and we have always commended this. Make of that what you will, friends.
Thank you very much. Hafsa.
So I'm 26, so I've not been alive for that long. But just thinking about my perceptions from what I've seen from my own community, at least the response to when I sort of very, very publicly was out everywhere, like, I'm very bi, hello, how do you do? It was very, very positive. The response I had was less, leave our community, you're not part of us, and more, we don't quite get it, but we pray in the same language, whatever. And although that might be hard to explain to people who aren't of faith, that to me is full acceptance from someone who may not understand where I'm coming from or what being queer is to me. And also, sort of anecdotally, I get a lot of messages from people saying, I'm Muslim, I'm queer, what do I do? I had someone reach out to me and she said, I really want to transition, but I also want to revert to Islam. What do I do? Do I have to choose between these? What should I do? And I suggested to her, I really think you should reach out to your local community, because although it's scary and I'm happy to support you in this, they want you to be happy. And I was really, really happy to find out that, because they said, what if the response is negative? Then I said, well, I'll be there, I'll support you. But let's just try and talk to someone about it. So she reached out to two different imams, so like two different sort of like scholars, or like the leaders of the mosque. One of them hung up the phone on her, did not want to know. And the other one was like, that's amazing, come to my house, let's have dinner together. And then this imam's wife was like, this is how you wear hijab, this is how you wear niqab, you're welcome, sister, you can come visit us anytime. And then she messaged me and she was like, you've just changed my life. And I was just like, that's a lot. I didn't do this. You did this. You're the one who made that decision to contact those people. I mean, I'm just the one who says, I think you should do it. But, she's the one who made that decision. And to me, I'm grateful that that response was the way it was. I mean, there's still going to be people who hang up the phone and think, this is not for me. I'm not interested. This is not part of Islam. But then there are also people who say, come into my home, eat with us. You're one of us. And I think that's remarkable, and it's not the stories we hear about all the time, because you hear these big, loud, angry people on the television proclaiming what is and isn't Islam, but they're not the people who are inviting people into their homes. The people who are being good to the community and caring for their fellow Muslims and non-Muslims are the ones who aren't on TV, the ones who are just being good in the community. And even if their level of tolerance is, I don't quite get it, but we still pray the same language, I don't quite get it, but we can still relate to one another in some way, then that's a really great place to be, and I think that shows incredible progress.
Yeah, I agree. Rachel, I'm going to come to you the next question. What is your response to people using your religion as a protection against having to accommodate for things that they personally do not support?
Yes. I'm so divided because there's something within me instinctively that says that a theological or a philosophical or an ethical position sincerely held, no matter what it is, does not legitimize the erasure of another human being. And if that's being used as an alibi, then it's time to re-examine your fundamental ideas. So, I mean, you can hear the hardness in me there. But again, just another story which doesn't completely change or queer the pitch, but it made me think. I was involved in a process a number of years back called the Shared Conversations. This was people who held opposing views on matters of sexuality, I guess, brought together to talk honestly and openly about their positions. And I will not reveal who this person was because that would be unfair. But I remember someone weeping in front of me who holds very conservative views on matters of sexuality, gender, actually on the relationship between men and women. And they were weeping because they realized, they acknowledged that they'd got out of time. There was a sense in which the world had moved on. And what was particularly painful for them, and please, I mean, you know, I'm not trying to elicit sympathy for them from the audience, but what I found quite moving was the sense in which they felt that even 15 years ago, they were much more in sync. And 25 years ago, they felt that they were in the heart of British society and that it had left them behind. And that moved me at a very human level. And what I'm absolutely determined to resist is turning those people I disagree with or consider opponents into ciphers or reverse scapegoats or people who are dehumanized, even when they dehumanize. I will not be that person.
Good.
So I'm reminded of the recent events in Birmingham around the protests outside Parkland and other schools on RSC inclusion in curriculum. What I found out through the charity was that the protesters and protest leaders were getting in touch with Sikh faith leaders in Birmingham. So it's quite fascinating. The backstory to this is, unfortunately, Asian communities, to my knowledge, don't get along that well in Birmingham as you would like. It was quite weird and tantalizing. The only thing uniting them there was homophobia, which is fascinating. So what I found out was that these protest leaders were getting in touch with Sikh faith leaders to join in their protests and protest outside schools because they wanted someone, for lack of a better word, visibly different to themselves, which, I mean, Sikhs tend to be. And I found out about the individuals who were contacted, and I'm not sure whether they were planning, but so Sarbat put out a statement saying that there is no way you'll justify your personal homophobia using your faith. The faith doesn't talk about homophobia, because if you do, I'll call you out, the group will call you out, kind of threatening them, to be honest. And I think that's the kind of way to approach these situations. Sometimes you have to say uncomfortable truth, and you have to make people kind of look into the mirror at their prejudices and try to examine where they come from. They definitely don't come from the faith.
Dalia.
I don't think you should or could, but you should use, obviously, Judaism or Jewish texts to be homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic. But I think the way that we approach it is through an educational response, because it's not always easy to say that. So, for example, with the stuff going on around SRE, our view is that every part of our community can do something to ensure that young people in their care understand that LGBT plus people exist. Now, in some parts, it will be saying basically as simple as that, which will still enable potentially someone to hear their identity being voiced. And that may not be good enough for some, but it's reducing harm and allowing for some conversation. In other spaces within the Jewish community, if that was all they were doing, it would be exceptionally disappointing. And actually there's parts of the community who go kind of above and beyond in terms of including, welcoming, celebratory, not only having LGBT plus Jewish voices, but understanding that they are essential in order for their communities to function. But I do think I think it's complicated, and I think it's hard because there isn't. There should not be a hierarchy, but I also don't believe that what you do should harm others. And I think it becomes complicated when you have Jewish text that's interpreted in a way that does exclude and harm and has been used in such a way. Yeah.
Yeah, no. Hafsa.
So I think from time immemorial, people have hidden behind how they identify or what they believe to be true to allow themselves to do whatever they feel like doing. And Islam is no exception. But what people fail to understand is when they quote things at me, I've read the same book. So when they say, oh, that person's not a Muslim because they're queer, I'm like, did you read the part where we're supposed to have a libas or a veil over each other's sins and we're supposed to protect one another? For example, if I'm seeing another Muslim sinning, and I don't believe being queer is a sin, but just follow me here. If I'm seeing another Muslim sinning, my job isn't to go, what you doing, mate? You're not Muslim now. It's to protect that person and then talk to them, educate them, and then let them know that they're still accepted. And in no way, shape, or form do I think being queer, being trans, being LGBT plus, being queer is a sin. But if these people are genuine in their belief that what I'm doing is wrong, then their reaction is wrong, at least if they're going by the Quran, by what we've been told, what we've been taught. So my reaction to that is they can hide behind scripture, they can hide behind all these things, but if you're not being good to another human being, if you really think that pointing out someone's flaws is the best way to be, then my response is, didn't you know pride's a sin? Maybe we should talk about that. But
what would your advice be for anyone who is nervous about coming out, who is a member of your faith? So I'm going to start with you and then we'll work our way back down.
I'd say first and foremost, your safety comes first. As much as I'd like to say, just come out, it's fine. Your safety is paramount. If you think you could be in danger or that you might be at harm's risk or you might be at risk or you might be in danger, it might be safer to come out in a different space, like work or with a friend, a trusted colleague, because I would never want someone to be in danger because of a situation where people are homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic. And I don't just mean physical violence, but emotional violence, putting themselves at danger. If you can find that just one person who accepts you for who you are, whether they're online, in real life, at an event, there will always be at least one person who sees you for who you are. And I think it's important to find those people, to find your people, find groups of queer individuals, queer people of faith groups, like the ones that we've mentioned today, just to know that you're not alone.
I just want to say ditto. And no, it's exactly that Jewish LGBT plus people do exist. And if you feel able and capable to, if the place that you have called home is not feeling safe, that there are other spaces. And that if they feel confident enough to talk to them, there are Jewish LGBT plus social groups, some that have been going for absolutely decades, to find friends. And actually, the community is really diverse. And so if they need support, whether they're Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi, which is kind of where your history comes from, and there are different cultures within those kind of communities of the Jewish faith, whether you're Orthodox, Reform, Mizorti, Liberal, cross-communal, whether you're a Jew of colour, whether you're that there are individuals that you can find and that you can talk to, but that your safety definitely has to come first, and that coming out is a point where you should feel safe to do so, and you're not a fraud for being completely out at university and loving life and having to come home and not be, but that hopefully at points there will be times where you can entirely be yourself, and that with time you'll find those spaces where, whether family, chosen or otherwise, exists consistently.
What I would say is the best thing in life is to be genuine and be your authentic self. Life is difficult at most times, and yes, when you're coming out, or if you're considering coming out, you will feel unsafe, but you need to be true to yourself. And I come from like a place of privilege, so I didn't have the kind of experiences that I've heard other people have in coming out. But I would tell them that there's lots of resources that the group has provided about the Sikh perspective on LGBT issues. There are lots of other faith groups that we work very closely with that can help you out. I would say to them that once you tell the near and dear ones in your life about your true self, about who you are, you'll have the best night's sleep ever that you've never had. And I think that's the kind of advice I'd be giving to them.
I'm not sure I have very much to add, but I simply to say, please do be safe. And it pains me to say this, but sometimes the only safe thing to do is walk away from your church community for a while, if you are in a place that is so toxic. However, there is extraordinary good news out there. I mean, I'm of an age where I grew up before the internet. And oh my goodness, isn't it amazing? It's magic. It's horrible at times, but it's like magic. And there are all these ways of connecting with people, which is just incredible. So in the Church of England alone, I mean, there's inclusive church. There's one body, one faith. There's diverse church. It takes one click to find a safe organisation, and through the Inclusive Church Hub, you can find a safe church. They're all listed there. And when I say safe, safer, because we are trying, but we are really working at it. So there is good news out there, and yeah, when it's time to come out, oh my goodness, I think you're right. It is a moment of pure liberation, actually. Always cost, of course. But to be oneself, isn't that a joy?
It certainly is. Thank you. I'm gonna have Philippa and Zoe come and bring the mics around. Are there any questions? If there are, please do raise your hand.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you so much to everyone putting on this on tonight. I was absolutely enthralled, so thank you. I was wondering if I could ask a little bit of advice, actually. Debate I often find myself in is, trying to, agree with you guys in that they can coexist, LGBT identities and religion. But the defence of the scripture says this does get thrown my way a fair bit. And am I right? The question I'm asking is, am I right in, sometimes I go back to them and say, well, the word of God was still written by humans and sort of somewhat interpreted, and we're totally imperfect beings, so we're going to get it wrong. So should we perhaps not take everything word for word? I know then you get into messy territory, because then that could apply to lots of other teachings. But is that a good route for me to go down? Because I struggle a bit sometimes. And I'm someone who was raised in a Christian family, but embrace all faiths. And I promise you I'm not just saying this. RE was quite literally my favourite subject at school and my best one. My nickname at school was the Rev as a result. So I really try to defend it as, we're imperfect, but is there some other way I could bolster that argument, or am I going about it completely the wrong way? I would love to learn and hear from you on that.
Honestly, if someone is talking to you and trying to deny your existence, walk away. They are not worth speaking to. I put those sorts of people on the same level as flat earthers and transphobes. They are trying to find a way to prove you out of existence, and they are not worth arguing with. In my opinion, if someone is throwing scripture at me, I'll just be like, cool story, and just move on. because they want to debate with you, they want to enrage you, they want to make you angry, they want to make you question everything, so they can point to you and say, there's an angry queer person, look, they're all like that. Don't take the bait. They're just trying to harass you, and they are just not worth any iota of your time. And if it's someone you have to interact with, one technique that's worth looking into is grey rocking, which is when basically you become like a grey rock. So if someone says, oh, hey, here's this horrible thing I want to tell you, be like, cool. And you just shut down the conversation. You don't respond. You don't justify what they're saying. You don't argue with them. You don't debate what they're saying, and you don't explain anything you're doing. You just shut things down with a one-word answer and try and leave the situation if you can. So if someone's saying, queer people are awful or something, you'll be like, great, and then walk away. Like, obviously not great, but, just shutting down the conversation as much as possible. So if you can, just look up grey rocking, because it's a very useful technique, especially in the workplace where you can't really be hostile or tell someone to stop sometimes, depending on the situation. Grey rocking just makes you so boring, no one wants to talk to you. It's very useful.
I wonder if I just offer an extra thought. I'd never heard of grey rocking before. Goodness, I'm going to start that. I think a substantial response goes far beyond what we can do here, but I'm nervous about what I'm about to say, because it's a room full of lawyers, and your business is argument. But my first career was as a teacher of philosophy, as a philosophy academic. And one of the things that maybe killed it for me, but also made me acknowledge the limits of it, is that there is only so far that a disputation can take us. In other words, arguments are interesting things, and we can put together, of course, a substantive argument. But when that becomes a kind of, here's an interrogation, and give me your answer, which is often preconditioned. I think, isn't that what barristers do? You go in and you want to know, you know what the answer is going to be before you ask the question. Well, that's I've seen too much TV. There are other ways of encounter, and I just think a more powerful way is storytelling, and actually saying, I'm looking to locate my story in this really, really rich and complex holy book. Let's say it's the Bible that's been composed over centuries. And let's see how we both locate ourselves within there. In other words, actually having a conversation, which is an exploration, rather than deploying proof texts or redacting out individual sentences. Because ain't that how we all live, whether we're people of faith or not? Is that we're kind of thematic beings. We're not reduced to a set of kind of beliefs in our heads. We are affective, we are embodied, we exist through time. I mean, I have to say the Church of England at its best really tries to practice that. Because we talk about scripture, reason, and tradition. And they weave themselves together. And when we talk about reason, we're talking about experience, your actual life. So do not apologize for who you are, but rather say, look, I want to live in and through this, but let's read it together as equals.
Do you have anything to add or no?
I just had a question about LGBT histories, and whether you felt your faith has, if there's like an erasure of LGBTI identities throughout the faith group.
Yeah, I definitely think so. One of the things I wanted to say earlier, if someone was going to come out, is like there is nothing more fun than being at like a queerda, which is like the Seder, which is the storytelling of the story of Passover, when you're telling the story about exiting slavery from Egypt, and actually you've made a queerda and you're with a bunch of people singing Beyonce's to the left, because actually you're meant to lean on a Seder. And having the opportunity, smart people, having the opportunity to queer our existence now is so incredible, because I think one of the joys that most LGBT plus people in general have is you have to think about things a bit more. You can't just get married. You have to think about what words you want and what language you want and what kind of family you want to have. And I think that extra thinking is such a joy, that when you come out and find that community, it's amazing. And I think in terms of our histories, they have been erased. And there's an entire book called Torah Queries, which has each bit of the Torah, but interpreted in a way that queers it, that understands the narrative of having your name changed and your identity changed and having to be a stranger, and how does that link to being LGBT+. And there's also been an oral history project, because it's been so erased that we didn't know who our great current LGBT+ Jewish people were, called Rainbow Jews, which you can find online, which tells the stories of past and present Jewish LGBT+ people, because like so many histories, our voices weren't included because it wasn't the dominant narrative that made sense. And it wasn't a narrative that we have interpreted into it, because actually within Judaism, a large percentage in the UK anyways believes that Torah is written by God. So it's not man-made, but then humans read it and explain it, and that has definitely erased a lot of our community.
There you go. Yep.
So the way I read into my faith and others is that was the best way people around that time came to terms with the complicated world around them. Not being able to explain things going amiss, losing people, losing family, losing their loved ones, so many other things. And their faith, or what we read into it today, was their best explanation of what was going on. And being a person of science, I obviously had issues with, flying animals and big boats and all sorts of things. But what I would say was that yes, based on my understanding, there has been erasure of LGBTI stories or histories in our history. There are lots of there's lots of mention of same-sex relationship in dharmic religions, as you'd call them, and they're almost never covered, or they're almost disappeared from existence. There are temples that talk about it, or they denote what's happening, etc. But there has been a massive erasure of LGBTQI identity. I definitely agree, and especially in the Sikh faith. When the faith was being formed, it was quite an evolution. There were lots of people who would be regarded as homosexual, ascetic people, and they were talked about in very passing, in ways that didn't ascribe anything great to them other than their contribution to the faith. But the other people get a lot more coverage, so I'd really like some sort of an academic study around this thing, but that's my understanding.
I was just wondering, as there are quite a few lawyers in the room, as was mentioned, do you feel that there are any current legal barriers preventing you from fully living your lives, both from a faith perspective and an LGBT perspective, that we should be thinking about tackling, and where perhaps the law that was accepted 10, 15 years ago is just not acceptable anymore?
Unsurprisingly, I would be thrilled if the Church of England could remove its quadruple lock on same-sex marriage. It is currently against the law for me to marry a same-sex couple in the parish church. And of course, as a member of the established church, I am a registrar in virtue of holding a license and my ordination, which does not apply to any other faith in England. The second thing is, and it doesn't affect me, but I am very conscious that many trans people and non-binary people find this incredibly difficult. We currently do not have a workable law around, and I need help here on the technical term, self-identification for trans people. And there is currently, in Scotland, of course, there is a consultation going on It seems to have been kicked into the long grass in England and Wales. I think this needs to be revisited. The law needs to be reformed. There is all sorts of panic that's been generated around it. Let's be clear here, Ireland has had self-identification for several years, and I know of no reported issues around that. But I think that's a key area that I would welcome lawyers looking into and putting pressure on our current government.
Does anybody else have anything to add?
So what we've come across in our group is around people who come out relatively later on in life. They have an established family, and the consequences of them coming out later on in life has quite profound effects on their mental health and people around them and their family, and some sort of protection around that. So that's one thing I can think of.
Yeah, just to echo the statements of Rachel, like we need the Gender Recognition Act has kind of taken a back burner, which is not good enough, especially for trans and non-binary people. I mean, although we have the Equality Act, the way it's worded is quite vague to the point where you could potentially exclude non-binary people because it's not specific enough. And we don't really have any protections when it comes to gender expression, gender fluid people. It's just all very, very vague. And again, I am not very au fait with the law. Very sorry to everyone in this room. But that's definitely something that needs to be worked upon because it's just not good enough for trans and non-binary people. And just, yeah, it just needs to be better. And I don't know how we can push that forward more. I'm sure many of you, the smart people in the room, can work that out. But it's, yeah, the GRA especially just needs to be pushed forward.
I mean, if anyone could explain the faith exemptions, that would be very helpful. Because I think the problem that we have is that when we work with different organizations in the LGBT plus community around areas around safeguarding or employment or education, we then go, but what about the faith exemptions? And they go, oh. And actually, I guess it's good and bad that there is a lack of clarity, but it does create a level of confusion when schools either want the law to be really clear so they can just say, well, it might not be what I agree with, but we have to do it. Or for schools to go, well, it's unsure, so we now have to work it out. And I think it is good that they're actually being forced to have a conversation and educate and bring everyone along in terms of this is what our values are and this is what we're doing, but it's confusing, the faith exemption sometimes.
I agree. I think we're going to leave it there because the speakers will be around. We have canapes and refreshments in the conservatory, so please feel free to ask them questions individually. Can we take this opportunity to give them a huge round of applause, please? Thank you all for coming. As I said, please do join us in the conservatory for some wine and canapes and some great conversation. Thank you, everybody.